There was a time when buying a game console felt simple. A new generation would launch at a premium price, early adopters would jump in, and then, as the years passed, the machine would slowly become more affordable. Maybe there would be a slimmer redesign, a holiday bundle, a price cut, or a special edition that made it finally feel like the right time to buy. That was the pattern people trusted. That was the rhythm of the console market. And now, that rhythm may be broken. Because what just happened with the PlayStation 5 is not just another price adjustment, it is a warning sign. Sony raising the price of the PS5 again, years into the generation, is not simply a story about one company charging more for one product. It is a much bigger story about where the gaming industry is going, who gets left behind, and whether the traditional console model is starting to price itself out of relevance. That is the real conversation, not just, wow, the PS5 is more expensive. The real conversation is, what happens to gaming when a 6-year-old console keeps getting more expensive instead of more accessible? And maybe even more importantly, what happens to the next generation if this is the new normal?
Because if you step back and look at this carefully, the PS5 price increase does not feel like an isolated event. It feels like the industry testing a new reality, a reality where the baseline cost of entry into console gaming keeps climbing, where waiting no longer saves you money, and where the promise that consoles are the affordable, simple way to game starts to fall apart. Let's start with the shock factor, because that matters. People are not reacting this strongly just because they have to pay more. They're reacting because this goes against decades of consumer expectation. In the old model, time worked in your favor. If you skipped the launch year, that was okay. You could wait for the inevitable deal. You could hold off until the library got bigger and the hardware got cheaper. Patience had value. But now, patience almost feels like a penalty. The longer you wait, the more expensive the system becomes. That reversal changes how people think about the entire console market. Suddenly, the message is not buy later when it's cheaper. The message is buy early before it gets worse. That is a completely different psychology, and it carries serious consequences. On paper, some people might joke that the PS5 has become an appreciating asset. If you bought one at launch, it is technically worth more now than it was then. That sounds funny at first, but it also highlights how strange this moment is. Consoles were never supposed to behave like collectibles, while they were still the active mainstream platform. They were supposed to follow the logic of consumer electronics, launch high, then gradually fall as manufacturing improves and the audience broadens. Instead, this generation has done something that still feels unnatural. It has normalized the idea that a mass-market gaming device can move upward in price even as it ages.
And that leads us to the bigger issue, accessibility. When the cost of console hardware rises this aggressively, the first thing that changes is not the headlines, it is the audience. Middle-income households start hesitating. Lower-income households get pushed out entirely. Families who might have once considered buying a console during year 4 or year 5 of a generation now look at the price and decide they simply cannot justify it. And for younger players, or people who only buy one major piece of gaming hardware every several years, that price barrier becomes enormous. This is where the old console equation starts to crack. Consoles were always partly defined by convenience, yes, but also by approachability. They were meant to be the easier on-ramp into gaming, not as complicated as building a PC, not as fragmented as mobile, and not as expensive as a high-end setup. But if the starting point for entry keeps climbing, then people do not just delay the purchase, many of them choose another path altogether. That alternative path could be last-generation hardware, it could be cloud gaming, it could be phones, it could be a modest PC running older games, it could even be subscription-based ecosystems where the hardware matters less than the service. The point is, gaming does not disappear when consoles become too expensive, it simply shifts somewhere else. And that is where Sony, and really the entire console industry, may be creating a long-term problem for itself. Higher pricing can preserve margins in the short term. It can satisfy investors. It can protect the company from rising costs in manufacturing, logistics, and components. But over time, the more people you price out, the smaller and more concentrated your audience becomes. You might still sell to dedicated players, wealthier households, and brand-loyal consumers, but the broader mainstream becomes harder to reach. That matters because the healthiest console generations were never powered only by enthusiasts. They were powered by mass adoption. They were powered by households where the purchase felt possible, even exciting. When people look back at certain eras of gaming as a golden age, part of what they are remembering is not just the games themselves. They are remembering a market where hardware felt attainable.
That is why the pricing conversation is bigger than inflation. For a while, people could explain rising console prices by saying, well, if you adjust older launch prices for inflation, it kind of makes sense. But that argument starts to weaken when we move beyond launch. This is no longer just about the value of the dollar changing over time. This is about a whole network of external pressures reshaping the business. Memory costs, supply chain friction, manufacturing complexity, shipping, energy, and now the broader tech economy pulling critical components in other directions. And one of the biggest factors people keep pointing to is the competition for memory and chips, especially as artificial intelligence infrastructure expands. Data centers, enterprise demand, and the race to build more AI capacity have all put pressure on the same parts ecosystem that gaming hardware depends on. Whether that remains a permanent condition or eventually cools off is still an open question, but at least right now, the effect is real enough that hardware makers seem comfortable passing those costs downstream to consumers. That is the moment we are in. Consoles are no longer protected from the larger battles happening in tech. They are not sitting in their own neat little entertainment bubble anymore. They are competing inside a much more aggressive economic environment, and players are the ones feeling the result. Now here is where things get even more interesting. Despite price increases, PlayStation has continued to perform strongly. That creates a dangerous incentive. If a company raises prices and sales remain strong, what lesson does it learn? Not, we went too far. It learns that the audience is willing to absorb more than expected. And once that lesson is internalized, it becomes much easier to imagine even steeper pricing in the future. Which brings us to the PlayStation 6. If the PS5 is already this expensive deep into its life cycle, then what exactly are people supposed to expect from the next generation system? This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because a lot of gamers still think about next-gen launches with old-gen expectations. They imagine a premium box, yes, but still something that feels broadly reachable. Maybe high, but not absurd. But if this generation has taught companies that the market will tolerate $600, $700, even $900 pricing, then the next generation may launch at a level that fundamentally changes what mainstream console even means. And that is the trap.
If the PS6 comes in too high, it risks being treated less like the natural next step and more like a boutique product, something for enthusiasts, early adopters, and people with disposable income, rather than a platform that the average player moves into naturally. That is fine for a pro model. It is not fine for your baseline future. Because once your base console starts to feel boutique, your generation has a scaling problem. Adoption slows, cross-generation support stretches longer, developers hesitate to leave older hardware behind. Players stick with what they already own, and suddenly, instead of a clean generational leap, you get a dragged-out transition where the old machine hangs on for years longer than expected, simply because too many people cannot or will not move. That is probably the most important long-term consequence of this PS5 price hike. It does not just make today's console harder to recommend, it potentially makes tomorrow's console harder to launch. Think about the logic from a consumer point of view. If someone is already staring at a PS5 price that feels too high, what are they going to do?
Some will buy anyway, sure, but many will say, if I'm paying this much already, I may as well save for the next thing. And if enough people adopt that mindset, the late generation PS5 audience starts thinning out precisely when Sony would normally want to pull in the holdouts. That changes the shape of the market before the PS6 even arrives. At the same time, if the PS6 launches at a price that feels excessive, those same holdouts may not upgrade at all. They may stay on PS5. They may wait several years. They may decide that the leap is not worth it, especially if Sony supports cross-gen software for a long time, which it almost certainly would have to do in that scenario. And the more that happens, the more the definition of a new generation starts to blur. Instead of feeling like a leap, it starts to feel like a premium tier. That should worry more than just Sony. It should worry anyone who cares about the identity of consoles as a category. Because if the next generation becomes too expensive, and if the transition becomes too slow, then consoles lose some of what made them culturally powerful in the first place. They stop feeling like the shared center of gaming life. They become one lane among many, competing against cheaper, more flexible, or already owned alternatives. And once consumers adjust to that world, it is hard to reverse. Now, to be fair, there are still strengths in the console model. Consoles remain easy to use. They still offer a controlled experience. They still matter for living room gaming, exclusive ecosystems, and straightforward access to major franchises. A lot of people still want that, but want and can afford are not the same thing. That is the line the industry is starting to test, and it may not like where that line eventually lands. There's also a cultural shift happening here that goes beyond pure economics. The more expensive consoles become, the more they move away from being universal entertainment devices and toward becoming status objects. Not for everyone, of course, but enough to matter. In some homes, the new console is not necessarily being bought because it is the center of daily gaming life. It's being bought because it is the premium device to have, the newest branded hardware, the signal that this household is current. That can sustain hardware sales to a point, but it doesn't guarantee the same level of software engagement or ecosystem health that a truly broad install base gives you. And the industry doesn't just live on hardware revenue. It lives on the software, subscriptions, downloadable content, microtransactions, accessories, and long-term ecosystem spending that happen after the box is sold. If the audience becomes narrower and wealthier, that can work for a while, but it may not replace the volume and cultural energy of a much broader player base.
So where does this leave gamers right now? Honestly, in a very awkward spot. If you do not already own a PS5, it is becoming increasingly hard to recommend one at these prices unless you are absolutely committed to the platform and know exactly why you want it. The value proposition just is not as obvious anymore. It's not that the PS5 is a bad machine, it's that the pricing has dragged it into a zone where consumers have every right to hesitate. And hesitation matters. Consumer hesitation is often the first visible sign that a market is reaching its limit. Not collapse, not disaster, but friction. That feeling of, wait, does this actually make sense for me? If enough people start asking that question at once, the entire launch strategy for the next generation gets more fragile. That is why this moment matters so much. Sony has not just changed a price tag, it has changed the conversation around console value, around next-gen expectations, and around who console gaming is really for. And the truth is, there may not be an easy fix. If component costs stay high, companies will keep pushing prices upward. If players keep paying, companies will feel validated. If the broader tech market keeps pulling resources toward AI infrastructure and enterprise demand, gaming hardware will keep competing from a weaker position. Unless something major changes in manufacturing, supply, or consumer tolerance, this may not be the peak. It may just be the current step. Which means the next few years are going to be incredibly revealing. If PS5 sales stay strong despite these increases, then Sony will go into its next generation with a dangerous amount of confidence. If sales soften meaningfully, then this year may become the data point that forces a rethink.
Either way, the result will shape what the PS6 looks like, how it is priced, and whether it launches as a mass-market platform or something closer to a luxury tier for dedicated players. So maybe the real story is not the PS5 just got more expensive. Maybe the real story is the future of consoles is being priced in right now. And if that is true, then this is not just a PlayStation story. It's a warning for the entire industry. Because once consoles stop feeling like the accessible center of gaming, they don't just become more expensive products, they become smaller worlds. And the moment that happens, the question is no longer how much the next console costs. The question becomes whether the old idea of the console generation can survive at all.